Ferry's government took the drastic action of attacking Tunisia, who they saw as responsible for the massacre. Tunisia quickly fell to French forces and was absorbed within the French Empire. A treaty was brought before the House of Deputies to approve the creation of a Tunisian protectorate, which passed almost unanimously, with only one vote against. That vote came from a certain George Clemenceau. And tensions flared up even further when Clemenceau accused the Ministry of the Interior of attempting to rig the elections for the Republicans when the date of the upcoming elections was called. Clemenceau decided his radicals would run against the Republicans in the following elections, which lowered the Republicans' number of seats pre-election to 286. Now let's see the results. Well, this was a close one, probably the closest election so far, although maybe not in the way you'd think. The Progressives came out on top, as they won 272 seats with 48.6% of the vote, while the Radicals had only won 166 seats with 26.6% of the vote, not coming particularly close to gaining the top spot. Even more disastrously than this, in the Var department, George Clemenceau had lost his own seat to Joseph Jourdan, an independent that had received backing both from the workers.
Prime Minister Sarian would not resign immediately, as had happened in the previous two elections, but he stayed around for a while. He would only resign in October, citing his poor health. The next Prime Minister would be...
My God! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm! Well,
The 1910 French legislative election took place on the 24th of April and 8th of May 1910 to elect 595 deputies to the French National Assembly. Yes, George Clemenceau, after decades in politics, finally acquired the prime ministership, after attaining his first ever ministerial portfolio less than a year prior. Clemenceau had faded out of the public eye for nearly a decade after he had lost his seat in the 1893 election, during which time he would write books, both literary and political, in order to ease the financial struggles and debts he was going through. However, he would come back into the public eye during the Dreyfus Affair, during which he would become one of the most prominent Dreyfusard journalists, publishing more than 700 articles on the topic, which made him a hero for some and a pariah for others. Clemenceau's political isolation would end in 1902, when the seat of an unmovable senator would open up in his home department of Var, triggering a snap by-election, one that Clemenceau would win thanks to his numerous political connections. Despite having started out as one of, if not the most left-wing members of the House of Deputies, in power Clemenceau would moderate, moving to the center, having become more pragmatic over his decade out of Parliament. This was seen in the fact that Clemenceau wasn't a member of a radical party, but rather that of a more moderate independent radicals. The first crisis Clemenceau would face upon assuming office would be that of a strike sweeping the country. Following the turn of the century, strikes by workers became a more common and accepted method for them to protest for better conditions from their employers. So much so that no part of France was spared from the mass strikes. It was from this that the CGT, one of France's biggest labor unions to this day, was born, and the strikes would reach their height in 1906, the year Clemenceau took power, with over 1,000 happening, lasting an average of 19 days. Labor groups were initially happy to see Clemenceau in power, since he had a history of being sympathetic to their cause. And they seemed to be correct when Clemenceau created the Ministry of Labor, but now in power he himself felt threatened by the mass strikes that were happening across the entire nation, and he fell back into the habit that had been conventional wisdom until the last decade. He would crush them. The most famous of these would take place in March 1906, back when Clemenceau was still the Interior Minister. The strike was supposed to have occurred in May, but was triggered prematurely after a gas explosion near Lille killed over 1,000 workers, sparking huge demonstrations. A young Maurice Torres, who would later lead the French Communist Party, later described running away from the site and being knocked over by a group of soldiers who were sent to restore order as his earliest memories. After this, another strike wave would sweep the country, which would likewise be mostly suppressed. There was another major strike the following year in Paris by electricians, and another one would occur in Languedoc by wine growers who felt undercut by the import of wine from Algeria. Both of these would likewise be suppressed by the national administration. These actions would get Clemenceau scorned by the SFIO party, which prior to this point had been open to working with him in government. Even Aristide Briand, who was the Minister of Justice in Clemenceau's government, was hostile to the strikes, despite coming from a party that called itself socialist. The repression was not just limited to manual laborers, however, as Clemenceau would also work to crush the growing movement among government employees to form their own public sector unions. Their existence was not outlawed, however they would not receive legal representation, and French governments would continue to try to crush them through using the legal system. Outside of the labor question, there were even more reforms throughout the 3-year-long tenure of the government that failed to pass. The first of these came from a finance minister, who proposed creating an income tax, and just like what feels like the last 100 times at this point, it failed. A debate on the death penalty would also start within Parliament, with Briand himself being sympathetic to its abolition. This largely came from a new president, Armand Fallières, who himself was opposed to the death penalty and refused to sign any death penalty warrants throughout his whole presidency. A law would be voted on by the House of Deputies to abolish the death penalty and replace all current sentences with life in prison, but the measure would be barely voted down by the House. Outside of labor, however, Clemenceau's greatest contribution during his first premiership would be in foreign affairs. He was becoming an increasingly important issue as tensions rose throughout Europe, and the possibility of a great war breaking out increased. France had already been preparing for such a war for nearly 2 decades, as the Franco-Russian alliance was alive and well, and France and Great Britain were becoming closer than they ever had before. Clemenceau would also push for European stability to be maintained at all costs internationally, something that made him look weak on the world stage. Tensions between France and Germany were strong, especially after the first Moroccan crisis of 1905, when Germany attempted to support Morocco's independence as France attempted to establish a protectorate over the country. The thing that would finally end Clemenceau's rule would be very unexpected. The French Navy had been experiencing some problems, and several major French ships would explode, which would trigger the resignation of the naval minister. The topic would come back during a parliamentary session in July 1909 when a report on the affair was published, and Clemenceau would dodge all questions, which made him look weak and caused him to lose a vote of no confidence. He would be succeeded as prime minister by his right-hand man, Aristide Briand, and he would govern in a very similar way to Clemenceau. He too would move to the center, approaching foreign policy pragmatically and continuing the strike-busting of Clemenceau. Overall, it was hard to pinpoint any real changes that were made from Clemenceau's time in power, and he had no major legislative accomplishments. Labor issues played a major part in the electoral campaign, with Jaurès having been keeping up the same rhetoric ever since the last election. Foreign policy also played a much bigger role than it ever had before due to the rising tensions in Europe. An interesting political development would actually come from the Nationalist Party, as to attempt to broaden their support, the party would more explicitly adopt left-wing economic stances, supporting trade unions against the strike-busting of the Clemenceau and Briand governments. The Nationalists were still a dying party, however, as their few supporters continued to flock either to the Republican Federation or to the Liberal Action Party. The right-wing coalition struggled in this election, as the government's move to the center made it so they had little to campaign against the government on due to them agreeing with the strike busting. But they kept up their message of religious and personal freedom, with them even supporting the idea of women's suffrage, which both the SFIO and the parliamentary left were opposed to. Now let's see the results. For the third time in a row, the left-wing coalition had come out on top. This time they won 352 seats, a slight decrease from the last election, despite the fact their popular vote percentage increased by a significant 5%. They benefited from bringing their brand to a wider range of voters through their move to the center over the previous 4 years. The right this time saw a rise in their seat count, gaining 17 seats, although this still left them nowhere near being able to form a government. The alliance had lost votes in the center from the radicals moderating, but they made up for it by picking up votes from a dying Nationalist Party, which only managed to win 7 seats in this election. Following this election, the Nationalist Party would never again manage to win any seats to Parliament. The SFIO capitalized off left-wing voters that felt betrayed by the strike-busting of Clemenceau and Briand to pick up 21 seats to get their best result in history. The success had been helped by the fact that Jaurès was skilled at always staying in a news cycle by opposing the government on nearly all fronts, to the point it sometimes felt the socialists were the real opposition force instead of the conservatives. The election had made small changes, but on the whole, Parliament looked the same, with voters only shifting due to the radicals' moderation and the collapse of the Nationalist Party. Briand would stay in office following the election, but he would form a new cabinet in November that shifted the government leftward, which would last until February of the next year. The Democratic Alliance Party, which had held 2 senior positions in Briand's first cabinet, would only hold the commerce portfolio in his second. Was this a sign of Briand shifting back to the left, or would the track of moderation continue? Thank you all for watching, and tune back in next time for the election of 1914.